What if I told you that one of the most important pieces of infrastructure supporting the American economy isn't located in the United States at all? What if I told you that millions of Americans flip on their lights every day, power their factories, run their data centers, irrigate their farms, and move billions of dollars in goods because of decisions being made hundreds of miles away, in another country? And what if that country suddenly gained far more leverage than most people realize? This is not a story about oil. It is not a story about military power. And it is not even primarily a story about trade. This is a story about water. Because hidden beneath the headlines about tariffs, trade disputes, and diplomatic tensions lies one of the most strategically important rivers on Earth. A river so vital that it powers a significant portion of the American Pacific Northwest and supports entire industries worth hundreds of billions of dollars. For more than 60 years, the United States and Canada worked together to manage this river through one of the most successful international agreements ever signed. But today, that cooperation stands at a crossroads. A political decision that barely attracted national attention could end up reshaping energy security, agriculture, transportation, and economic relations across North America. And the most remarkable part? The country holding the strongest position may not be the country most people expect. Because when it comes to rivers, geography always wins. And Canada happens to be upstream. To understand why this matters, we need to travel back nearly 80 years. In May 1948, disaster struck the Pacific Northwest. The city of Vanport, Oregon, was home to nearly 19,000 residents and had rapidly expanded during World War II. Then, the Columbia River flooded. Within hours, entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath the water. Homes were destroyed, businesses vanished, families lost everything. The flood became one of the most devastating natural disasters in the history of the region. For American policymakers, it delivered a painful lesson. The United States could build dams, it could construct levees, it could invest billions in infrastructure. But there was one thing it could not change. The source of the river was largely outside its control. The Columbia River begins in Canada. The snowpack, the reservoirs, the upstream flow management. Much of it sits north of the border, and that meant any long-term solution required cooperation. Negotiations were not simple. For 16 years, diplomats, engineers, economists, and politicians worked to create a solution. Multiple American presidents came and went. Several Canadian governments changed. Yet both countries understood something fundamental. Neither could fully manage the Columbia River alone. Finally, in 1964, they signed what became known as the Columbia River Treaty. The agreement transformed the region. Canada agreed to make enormous sacrifices. Entire communities were relocated. Thousands of hectares of valuable land disappeared beneath reservoirs. Farmland was flooded. Historic sites were lost. Large dams, including Mica, Keenleyside, and Duncan, were constructed to regulate water flow throughout the system. These projects gave Canada extraordinary control over how water moved downstream. But they also provided immense benefits to the United States. Flood protection improved dramatically. Hydroelectric generation became more reliable. Agricultural planning became easier. Transportation became more predictable. In exchange, Canada received compensation through what became known as the Canadian Entitlement, a share of the downstream power benefits created by Canadian water storage. For decades, both countries considered the arrangement a success. Few international resource agreements lasted as long or worked as effectively. Many people hear River Treaty and assume this is a niche issue affecting only a handful of communities. The reality is far larger. The Columbia River system is one of the most productive river networks in North America. Stretching roughly 2,000 kilometers, it serves as the backbone of the Pacific Northwest economy. The hydroelectric facilities connected to the Columbia Basin generate an enormous share of the region's electricity. This power supports households, manufacturing plants, technology companies, ports, transportation systems, and data centers. Think about that for a moment. Every internet search processed in a major Pacific Northwest data center, every aluminum smelter, every manufacturing facility, every refrigerated warehouse, every electric train, every agricultural processing plant, all depend, directly or indirectly, on the river. For 60 years, the treaty functioned remarkably well. But time changes everything. Climate patterns evolved, energy markets changed, population growth accelerated, new environmental priorities emerged. Both countries recognized that the treaty eventually needed modernization. Negotiators spent years discussing updates. Experts worked through complex technical details. Eventually, an agreement in principle was reached to modernize the framework. The goal was not to replace cooperation. The goal was to strengthen it for the next generation. Then, politics intervened. Government priorities shifted, leadership changed, and suddenly, a carefully negotiated modernization effort became entangled in broader disputes involving trade, tariffs, and economic leverage. Instead of moving forward, momentum stalled. Then came a decision that surprised many observers. The modernization process effectively collapsed. What appeared to some as a tactical political maneuver created consequences few people fully appreciated. Because when you walk away from an updated framework, the old framework doesn't disappear. It returns. And that changed the strategic landscape dramatically. There is an old saying, "It is better to be upstream with a shovel than downstream with a legal document." That phrase captures the reality of the Columbia River better than any political speech ever could. Governments can negotiate. They can threaten tariffs. They can impose sanctions. They can hold press conferences. But none of those things changes geography. The water still originates upstream. The reservoirs remain upstream. The storage capacity remains upstream. The physical control points remain upstream. And upstream means Canada. This is where many political debates collide with reality. Modern governments often assume that economic power can solve every problem. Need more energy? Spend more money. Need more infrastructure? Pass another bill. Need more resources? Sign another contract. But rivers do not operate on political timelines. A dam cannot be built overnight. A watershed cannot be relocated. Decades of infrastructure cannot be replaced in a single election cycle. Nature moves slower than politics, and the Columbia River is a perfect example. This is the question policymakers increasingly face. Nobody is suggesting that Canada would simply shut off the river. That is not how international water systems operate. But total shutdown is not the real issue. Even relatively small changes can create enormous consequences. A slight adjustment in flow management, different reservoir priorities, reduced flexibility during drought conditions, changes in seasonal coordination. Each decision could ripple throughout the system. Power producers might face greater uncertainty. Agricultural operations could experience new challenges. Shipping schedules could become less predictable. Infrastructure planning would become more complicated. And all of this would occur within an economy already facing inflation pressures, energy transitions, and global competition. The costs would not necessarily appear immediately. They would emerge gradually. But over time, those costs could become enormous. Because the Columbia River is not a single asset. It is a foundation. And foundations are hardest to replace when they begin to crack. For years, discussions about North American economic power have focused primarily on the United States. The reasoning seemed obvious. America has the world's largest economy, the world's reserve currency, the world's most powerful military, the largest consumer market on Earth. All true. But power comes in many forms. Some forms are obvious, others are hidden. And resource geography creates a unique kind of leverage. Canada does not need to threaten anyone. It does not need dramatic announcements. It does not need headlines. Its leverage comes from simple physical reality. The water starts in Canada. The storage capacity exists in Canada. The reservoirs exist in Canada. The upstream management occurs in Canada. That reality gives Ottawa influence that cannot easily be replicated elsewhere. It is a form of strategic advantage created not by politics, but by geography itself. And geography is notoriously difficult to negotiate away. The Columbia River story reveals something much larger than a dispute between two neighboring countries. It reveals how the 21st century economy is becoming increasingly dependent on infrastructure that people rarely think about. Water, electricity, supply chains, transmission networks, transportation corridors, critical minerals, pipelines, ports. These systems operate quietly in the background. Most people notice them only when something goes wrong. Yet they often determine economic success more than headlines do. For decades, the Columbia River Treaty represented a model of practical cooperation. Two countries recognized their mutual dependence and built a framework that delivered prosperity for both sides. Today, that framework faces uncertainty, and the consequences extend far beyond diplomatic talking points. Because when millions of jobs, billions of dollars in trade, and the energy security of an entire region depend on a river, every decision carries enormous weight. The lesson is simple. Governments can change, policies can change, trade disputes come and go, but geography remains. And as long as the Columbia River flows south from Canada into the United States, one fact will continue to shape the future of North America. Canada will remain upstream. And in the world of water, being upstream may be one of the most powerful positions imaginable. Do you think the United States underestimated Canada's strategic importance in the Columbia River system? Or will both countries eventually be forced back to the negotiating table? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into North American geopolitics, energy security, and hidden economic leverage, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next analysis.